the radar screens went blank over the southern border. A silence louder than any siren has just descended on Washington. The engines of the C-17 Globemaster are spinning down on the Texas tarmac. Mexico has not just said no. They have closed the door forever. This is the moment the mass deportation plan hit a concrete wall. Diplomacy has failed, and the military option is now off the table. The White House is scrambling for a backup plan that doesn't exist. Subscribe now if you want to know the truth behind the panic. Comment sovereignty below if you think Mexico made the right call. Welcome to the geopolitical crisis that changes everything. The heat radiating off the tarmac at Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas was enough to distort the air, creating shimmering mirages that danced above the concrete like ghosts of the tension gripping the two nations. Inside the cockpit of the massive C-17 Globemaster III, the pilot wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, not from the temperature, but from the voice crackling in his headset. For the last 20 minutes, the aircraft, loaded with detainees, and designated for a direct flight to an interior airfield in central Mexico, had been idling, burning thousands of gallons of fuel while awaiting final clearance. The flight plan had been filed days ago, a routine part of the new administration's accelerated deportation initiative, but today, the frequency was dead silent on the receiving end. Then, the static broke, replaced by the calm, heavily accented voice of a Mexican air traffic controller who delivered a message that would ripple through the corridors of power from Mexico City to Washington, D.C. United States Air Force Flight 802, be advised, the voice said, stripping away any ambiguity with a tone that sounded more like a judicial sentence than a navigational instruction. Entry into Mexican sovereign airspace for military aircraft conducting repatriation operations is permanently denied. Turn around or divert immediately. The pilot looked at his co-pilot, a moment of stunned disbelief passing between them, as if they had just been told the laws of physics no longer applied. This wasn't a delay due to weather. It wasn't a bureaucratic mix-up regarding a manifest code. This was a hard stop, a calculated slamming of the door that transformed a military transport mission into an international incident in the span of 10 seconds. On the ground, the logistics officers who had spent months coordinating these flights watched the situation unfold on their tablets with a growing sense of dread. The entire architecture of the mass deportation strategy relied on the speed and capacity of military aircraft to bypass the bottleneck of commercial airports and border crossings. By using heavy lifters like the C-17, the administration planned to move thousands of individuals a day, deep into Mexico, away from the immediate border zone to prevent rapid re-entry. Without access to Mexican airspace for these specific military tails, the efficiency of the operation collapsed instantly. The plane on the runway began its slow, lumbering turn back toward the hangar, a physical symbol of a policy that had just been grounded. 3,000 miles away, inside the Situation Room of the White House, the atmosphere shifted from routine monitoring to acute crisis management as the news filtered up the chain of command. Aides scurried with tablets, pulling up real-time flight tracking data that showed a wall of empty airspace south of the Rio Grande, where a steady stream of transport planes should have been. The silence in the room was punctuated only by the aggressive tapping of fingers on mahogany tables and the low murmur of urgent phone calls being placed to the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City. The administration had gambled that Mexico would fold under the threat of economic pressure, that the fear of tariffs would keep the airspace open. They were wrong. President Claudia Sheinbaum's administration had not only refused the flight, they had issued a diplomatic cable that was currently being printed out in the State Department, declaring a permanent prohibition on the use of foreign military assets for immigration enforcement on Mexican soil. The language was precise, legalistic, and devastatingly firm, citing national sovereignty and the dignity of the Mexican state. It was a maneuver that stripped the U.S. president of his most potent visual tool, the image of military efficiency resolving the border crisis. Now, instead of footage of planes taking off, the news cycle would be dominated by images of stalled aircraft and a diplomatic stalemate. The panic in Washington wasn't just about optics, it was about the sheer mathematics of the border crisis. Without the air bridge, the Department of Homeland Security was forced to rely on buses and commercial charter flights, methods that were 10 times slower and infinitely more expensive. The sheer volume of detainees currently in holding facilities meant that a bottleneck was forming at a rate of hundreds per hour. If they couldn't move people out, they couldn't take people in. The entire detention system, already strained to its breaking point, was facing a catastrophic overcrowding scenario within 48 hours. Generals in the Pentagon, men who were used to logistical challenges involving tanks and ammunition, found themselves defeated by a diplomatic pen stroke. They looked at maps of the Gulf of Mexico, tracing longer, inefficient routes that would bypass Mexican airspace to land in Central America, only to realize the fuel costs and flight times would double, making the operation unsustainable. The panic's headline flashing across cable news tickers wasn't hyperbole. It was a reflection of the reality that the U.S. government had lost control of the tempo of its own operation. The realization settled in that they could not bully their neighbor into submission, at least not today. Meanwhile, in Mexico City, The National Palace stood as a fortress of calm amidst the storm it had just unleashed. President Scheinbaum, flanked by her foreign minister and the Secretary of National Defense, reviewed the morning's events with a stoic determination. This was not a rash decision made in the heat of the moment. It was the culmination of weeks of internal debate regarding the dignity of the nation. The narrative they were constructing was one of strength Mexico as a partner, not a subordinate. By blocking military flights, they were drawing a line in the sand that defined the terms of the new relationship. The streets outside the Zocalo were buzzing with a mixture of anxiety and pride. News vendors shouted headlines about the defense of sovereignty, and for the average citizen, the sight of their government standing up to the Colossus of the North sparked a complex emotional response. There was fear, certainly, of the economic retaliation that might follow the tariffs. The slowdowns at the border bridges, where tomatoes and auto parts waited in the sun, but there was also a profound sense of validation. For decades, U.S. policy had dictated the flow of people and goods. Today, Mexico had seized the remote control. Back in Washington, the economic advisors were already drafting the response, their screens filled with spreadsheets detailing potential tariff schedules. The threat was a blunt instrument, a 25% tariff on all Mexican imports until the flights resumed. It was a nuclear option for the North American economy, one that would send the price of avocados in New York and pickup trucks in Detroit skyrocketing. But the political calculus demanded a show of force. The president could not be seen as weak, not on his signature issue. The order was being drafted, the rhetoric sharpened, ready to turn a diplomatic dispute into a full-blown trade war. However, the business lobbies were already flooding the phone lines of Congress, warning that such a move would trigger a recession before the fiscal year was out. The integration of the U.S. and Mexican supply chains was so deep, so inextricable, that punishing Mexico was akin to the U.S. shooting itself in the foot. Auto manufacturers, who relied on parts crossing the border 5 or 6 times before a car was finished, were in a state of near hysteria. The panic wasn't just political, it was corporate. The blocking of a few planes had exposed the fragility of the entire continental economic system. On the border itself, in cities like El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, the abstract geopolitical fight was manifesting in gritty, dusty reality. The bridges, usually flowing with a steady stream of traffic, began to slow as customs and border protection agents were redeployed to deal with the overcrowding in detention centers. Rumors flew through the migrant camps on the Mexican side, whispers that the air deportation was over, that the Americans had blinked. This created a dangerous surge of hope, a magnetic pull that drew more people toward the riverbank, believing that the enforcement mechanism had broken down. The blockade of military flights also meant that the U.S. lost its ability to return non-Mexican nationals effectively. The C-17s were primarily intended to fly Haitians, Venezuelans, and Colombians deep into the interior or to their home countries via complex routing. Now, these individuals were stuck in a legal limbo, filling up the processing centers in Texas and Arizona. The Remain in Mexico policy was being tested to its limits, as Mexico simply refused to accept the return of anyone who wasn't a Mexican citizen without the prior logistical agreement that had just been canceled. Inside the detention facilities, the atmosphere was growing volatile. Men and women who had been processed for immediate expulsion found themselves sitting in holding cells with no departure time. The guards, overworked and underinformed, could offer no answers. The system was designed for flow, not storage. As the hours ticked by, the heat rose, and the tension in the crowded cages became palpable. The blockage of the flights was acting like a dam on a rushing river. Eventually, the water would have to go somewhere, and the pressure was building against the walls of the U.S. immigration system. President Scheinbaum's gamble relied on the belief that the U.S. needed Mexico's cooperation on drugs and security more than it needed these specific flights. She was betting that the White House would not risk dismantling the security cooperation framework that targeted cartels just to save face on the deportation issue. It was a high-stakes game of poker played with human lives and billion-dollar industries. Her advisors believed that by taking a hard stand on the military nature of the flights, framing them as an affront to sovereignty, she could force the U.S. to the negotiating table for a more humane, civilian-led process. The U.S. response, however, was unpredictable. The panic described in the headlines was driving erratic decision-making. There were discussions of rerouting flights to friendly air bases in Guatemala, bypassing Mexico entirely, but the range and cost made it a logistical nightmare. Every alternative was worse than the original plan. The administration was trapped in a box of its own making, having promised a mass deportation spectacle that it physically could not deliver without the cooperation of the very country it was antagonizing. As evening fell over the Rio Grande, the standoff deepened. The empty sky where the C-17s should have been roaring was a stark reminder of the new reality. The border had always been a place of friction, but this was different. This was a systemic rupture. The permanent blocking of military flights signaled the end of the era where the U.S. could unilaterally dictate the terms of border enforcement. Mexico had realized that while it couldn't match the U.S. in firepower or wealth, it held the keys to the gate. The implications for the coming weeks were staggering. If the U.S. followed through on tariff threats, the peso would tumble, inflation in Mexico would rise, and the very economic instability that drives migration would worsen, creating a feedback loop of crisis. Yet if the U.S. backed down, the administration would look toothless. The panic was the realization that there were no good options left. The chessboard had been flipped, and the pieces were scattered on the floor. In the Pentagon, analysts were writing reports on the strategic failure of the Deportation air bridge. They noted that the reliance on foreign airspace permission was a critical vulnerability that had been overlooked. In the rush to implement the policy, the report, marked classified, concluded that without Mexico's active participation, the goal of removing millions of undocumented immigrants was mathematically impossible. It was a sobering splash of cold water on the fiery rhetoric of the campaign trail. The cultural impact of the decision was reverberating through social media in both countries. In the U.S., supporters of the crackdown were furious, demanding that the military simply ignore the Mexican denial, a suggestion that would amount to an act of war. In Mexico, hashtags celebrating national dignity were trending, painting Sheinbaum as a defender of the patria. The narrative war was just as intense as the diplomatic one, with both sides digging into their ideological trenches. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the border wall, the physical barrier seemed less significant than the invisible diplomatic wall that had just been erected. The permanent nature of the block meant this wasn't a temporary hiccup to be smoothed over with a phone call. It was a structural change. The U.S. was no longer the sole architect of North American migration policy. It now had to negotiate for every inch of airspace, for every landing slot, for every deportee returned. The fear in the eyes of the migrants waiting under the bridges was matched only by the anxiety in the eyes of the policymakers in Washington. Both groups were facing an uncertain future where the old rules no longer applied. The blocking of the flights was the first domino in a chain reaction that threatened to reshape the economy, the security landscape, and the demographic reality of the continent. In the days to come, we would see if this panic would lead to a breakthrough or a breakdown. Would the U.S. militarize the border further in retaliation? Would Mexico use its leverage to demand regularization for its citizens in the U.S.? The game had changed. The planes were grounded, and in the silence of the airfield, the sound of a new geopolitical era was beginning to ring in everyone's ears. The sheer scale of the logistical failure cannot be overstated. We are talking about a fleet of aircraft, millions of dollars in fuel contracts, and thousands of personnel hours that were rendered useless in an instant. The U.S. military is a machine built for precision and overwhelming force, but it is not built to handle the nuance of a polite but firm no from a neighbor. The humiliation of having to turn a loaded plane around is something that stings the pride of the armed forces deeply. This event forces us to question the very nature of power in the 21st century. Is power the ability to fly a C-17? Or is power the ability to say who lands in your backyard? Mexico has demonstrated a form of soft power that is remarkably hard, proving that sovereignty is not just a concept in a textbook but a lever that can jam the gears of a superpower. The next 24 hours are critical. If the U.S. escalates, we could see the border close entirely to trade, a move that would be catastrophic. If they negotiate, it will be a quiet admission that the era of unilateral dictates is over. Watch the skies, and watch the markets. The story is not just about immigration anymore. It's about who truly controls North America. The dust has not yet settled, and the engines have cooled, but the heat of this conflict is just beginning to rise. The permanent block is a fact. The panic is real, and the consequences will be felt by every single person watching this. Whether you are in a boardroom in New York, a factory in Monterrey, or standing on the banks of the Rio Grande, praying for a miracle. Ultimately, this is a story about the limits of military power, the limits of diplomacy, and the limits of human endurance. As night covers the continent, the only thing certain is that tomorrow will bring a new kind of struggle. The airspace is closed, but the issue is more open and raw than ever before. We are witnessing history being written, not with ink, but with the contrails of planes that never arrived. The silence of the grounded fleet speaks volumes. It tells us that the world is more interconnected and more resistant to simple solutions than the slogans would have us believe. The U.S. panicked because it looked in the mirror and realized that without its neighbors, it is an island. And islands, no matter how powerful, can be isolated. As the frantic meetings in the White House continue into the early hours of the morning, one truth becomes clear. The easy solution of mass deportation via military airlift was a mirage. The hard reality is on the ground, in the dirt, in the complex web of laws and human lives that make up the border. And that reality just got a lot more complicated. The pilots have gone home. The planes are dark. But the eyes of the world are wide open, watching to see who blinks first in this high-stakes stare-down. The permanent block is the new status quo. Adjust your expectations accordingly. The panic is just the beginning.